Karen had always dreamed of visiting London. The city seemed like something out of a storybook to her, a place where history met modernity, and every corner held a new adventure. Growing up in a small town in America, she spent countless hours watching documentaries about the British monarchy, marveling at the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, and imagining what it would feel like to stand face to face with the famous royal guards. So when she finally saved enough money for her dream vacation, Karen couldn't contain her excitement. The flight to London was long but worth every minute. As soon as she stepped off the plane, Karen felt a thrill run through her veins. She checked into her hotel, unpacked her suitcase, and immediately set out to explore the city. Her first stop, Buckingham Palace, of course. Armed with her camera, oversized sunglasses, and a tote bag filled with essentials, including a can of pepper spray that she carried everywhere just in case, Karen joined the bustling crowd outside the palace gates. It was a sunny afternoon, and tourists from all over the world were gathered there, snapping photos and chatting excitedly. Some posed for pictures beside the guards, while others simply admired the palace's stunning architecture. Karen stood among them, gazing up at the towering structure with wide-eyed wonder. Everything about it felt magical. The golden gates, the sprawling gardens, and the red-coated guards standing perfectly still like statues come to life. Karen had read plenty about the royal guards before her trip. She knew they weren't allowed to move or speak unless necessary, and she found their discipline oddly fascinating. But today, seeing them in person for the first time, she realized how much bigger and more imposing they looked compared to the images she'd seen online. Their bright red uniforms and towering bearskin hats gave them an almost larger-than-life presence. To Karen, they didn't just look like soldiers, they looked like characters straight out of a movie. As she wandered closer to one of the guards stationed near the entrance, Karen noticed how many people were taking selfies with him. His expression remained completely blank, no matter how silly or creative the poses got. A group of kids even waved at him, giggling when he didn't react. Karen smiled too, feeling a mix of awe and amusement. But beneath her excitement, a tiny seed of nervousness began to grow. You see, Karen wasn't exactly known for being calm under pressure. Back home, she often joked that she could turn any minor inconvenience into a full-blown panic attack. And now, surrounded by strangers in a foreign country, she couldn't shake the feeling that something unexpected might happen. What if someone tried to pickpocket her? What if she accidentally broke some unspoken rule and embarrassed herself? Or worse, what if the guards thought she was doing something wrong? Her eyes darted around the area, scanning the crowd for anything suspicious. That's when she noticed one particular guard standing a few feet away. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform immaculate, and his posture ramrod straight. For a moment, Karen thought he glanced in her direction. Was he looking at her? Did he notice her fidgeting with her purse? Her mind started racing with questions, each one amplifying her growing anxiety. Little did Karen know, this seemingly ordinary encounter was about to take a turn she'd never forget. As Karen stood there, her mind racing with irrational thoughts, she couldn't help but fixate on the guard who had briefly turned his head. To anyone else, it might have seemed like nothing more than a routine movement, a slight adjustment, or perhaps just a momentary glance at the crowd. But to Karen, it felt deeply personal, as though he were singling her out for some unknown reason. Her heart began to beat faster, and her palms grew clammy as she clutched her tote bag tighter. Karen's imagination spiraled out of control. She started replaying everything she'd done since arriving at the palace gates. Had she accidentally stepped too close to the restricted area? Was her camera somehow blocking someone's view? Or worse, had she unknowingly broken some unwritten rule about interacting with the guards? Every possibility seemed plausible in her increasingly anxious state. The guard, meanwhile, remained perfectly still, his face expressionless. His eyes didn't linger on Karen for more than a second before scanning the rest of the crowd. This was standard protocol. Royal guards are trained to remain vigilant and observant without showing any emotion. But Karen didn't know that. All she could focus on was the fact that his gaze had momentarily landed on her, and now she was convinced he was watching her every move. Her nervousness only intensified when she remembered something she'd read online during her pre-trip research. Royal guards weren't allowed to smile or engage with tourists unless absolutely necessary. While most people found this amusing, Karen interpreted it differently. To her, their stoic demeanor made them seem almost robotic, unpredictable, and intimidating. And now, standing so close to one, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was silently judging her. Karen tried to distract herself by taking photos of the palace and scrolling through her phone for tips on proper etiquette around the guards. But no matter how hard she tried to calm down, her anxiety kept bubbling to the surface. Her thoughts ping-ponged between self-doubt and paranoia. What if they think I'm being disrespectful? She wondered. What if I get into trouble for something I didn't even realize I did wrong? Then, another thought struck her, one that sent a fresh wave of panic coursing through her body. What if the guard wasn't just observing her casually? What if he suspected her of something? After all, she was carrying pepper spray in her purse. In America, it was considered a safety precaution, but here in London, would it be seen as a weapon? Would they assume she meant harm? The idea was absurd, but Karen's overactive imagination didn't care about logic. All she could picture was the guard suddenly stepping forward and confronting her, or worse, calling for backup. She glanced around nervously, noticing how many families and couples surrounded her. Everyone else seemed relaxed, laughing and enjoying themselves without a care in the world. Why couldn't she be like them? Why did she always have to overthink everything? Karen sighed, trying to take deep breaths and remind herself that she was safe. Nothing bad was going to happen. The guard was just doing his job, and she was just another tourist snapping pictures. But despite her attempts to rationalize the situation, Karen's unease continued to grow. Every time the guard shifted slightly or adjusted his stance, she flinched, convinced he was about to approach her. Her grip tightened on her tote bag, where the pepper spray lay nestled among her belongings. It was supposed to make her feel safer, yet now it only added to her stress. If anything went wrong, would using it even help? Or would it make things worse? Unbeknownst to Karen, her heightened state of fear was clouding her judgment. Instead of seeing the guard as a symbol of tradition and duty, she saw him as a potential threat. And as the seconds ticked by, her fight-or-flight response began to kick in. Without realizing it, Karen was edging closer to making a decision that would change the course of her day, and possibly her entire trip, in ways she could never have anticipated. Karen's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts, each one louder and more urgent than the last. She tried to remind herself that she was overreacting, that the guard wasn't paying any special attention to her, but her body refused to listen. Her heart pounded in her chest like a drum, and her breaths came in short, uneven gasps. The pepper spray in her tote bag suddenly felt heavier, as though it were begging to be used. She glanced around again, searching for reassurance from the people nearby. Families posed for photos, couples laughed together, and children pointed excitedly at the guards. Everything seemed normal, except for Karen. To her, the cheerful atmosphere felt surreal, almost mocking, as if everyone else knew something she didn't. Why was she the only one who felt this way? Why did she feel so exposed, so vulnerable? Her eyes darted back to the guard. He hadn't moved much since she'd first noticed him, but now every tiny shift he made sent her nerves into overdrive. When he adjusted his weight slightly from one foot to the other, Karen's stomach churned. When he tilted his head ever so slightly, she nearly jumped out of her skin. Every movement felt deliberate, calculated, as though he were closing in on her. And then it happened. The guard took a single step forward. To anyone else, this would have been completely unremarkable. Guards often shifted positions or changed their stance after standing still for long periods. It was part of their routine, a way to stay alert and comfortable while maintaining their disciplined appearance. But to Karen, this small action felt monumental. Her brain screamed at her, "He's coming for you." In that split second, logic abandoned her entirely. All those hours spent watching crime shows and reading about self-defense flooded her mind, convincing her that danger was imminent. Her grip tightened on the strap of her tote bag, and without even realizing what she was doing, she reached inside and wrapped her fingers around the cold metal canister of pepper spray. Her palms were slick with sweat, and her vision narrowed until all she could focus on was the guard. Her breathing quickened, and her muscles tensed, ready to spring into action. Somewhere deep down, a faint voice whispered that she was being irrational, that nothing bad was actually happening. But it was drowned out by the deafening roar of panic coursing through her veins. The crowd around her blurred into the background. The laughter, the chatter, the clicking of cameras. It all faded away until Karen felt like she was trapped in her own private nightmare. Her instincts took over, fueled by fear and adrenaline. She told herself she was just being cautious, that she needed to protect herself. If the guard really was about to confront her, or worse, she had to be prepared. But preparation quickly turned into preemptive action. As the guard took another measured step forward, Karen's finger twitched against the button of the pepper spray. Her mind raced through scenarios. What if he grabbed her? What if he shouted at her? What if she ended up in some kind of trouble she couldn't escape from? In her panicked state, she convinced herself that using the pepper spray wasn't just an option, it was a necessity. Before she could stop herself, Karen pulled the canister halfway out of her bag, her thumb hovering nervously over the nozzle. Her hands trembled, and her throat felt dry. For a brief moment, she hesitated, glancing around to see if anyone else noticed how tense she was. But no one was looking at her. Everyone was too busy enjoying the spectacle of the palace and its iconic guards. That's when it hit her, the realization that she might actually go through with this. The thought terrified her, but not enough to override the fear gripping her heart. Her vision tunneled further, focusing solely on the guard as he continued his slow, deliberate movements. Karen's pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out everything else. She didn't want to do this. She didn't want to cause a scene or draw attention to herself. But her body wasn't listening to reason anymore. Fear had taken the wheel, and there was no turning back. With one final surge of panic, Karen raised the pepper spray, aimed it toward the guard, and pressed the button. The moment Karen pressed the button on the pepper spray, a fine mist shot out in a short burst, catching the unsuspecting royal guard squarely in the face. Time seemed to freeze for a split second as the crowd collectively gasped, their cheerful chatter turning into stunned silence. The guard, who had been standing tall and stoic just moments before, stumbled backward, his hands instinctively flying to his eyes. His usually rigid posture crumbled as he coughed and sputtered, clearly caught off guard by the sudden attack. For Karen, the world around her spun wildly out of control. 1 second, she was consumed by fear and adrenaline, convinced she was protecting herself from an imagined threat. The next, reality crashed down on her like a tidal wave. She watched in horror as the guard struggled to recover, his movements frantic and disoriented. Her heart sank as the gravity of what she'd done hit her, hard. "Oh no," Karen whispered under her breath, her voice trembling. "What have I done?" The chaos escalated almost instantly. Other guards nearby sprang into action, rushing toward their colleague to assist him. Their disciplined composure cracked slightly as they called out to each other, their voices sharp with urgency. Tourists scrambled to get out of the way, some stepping back in shock, while others whipped out their phones to film the unfolding scene. Within seconds, the once peaceful atmosphere outside Buckingham Palace transformed into something resembling pandemonium. Karen stood frozen, her arms still raised, the pepper spray dangling limply from her hand. Her mind raced, trying desperately to process what had just happened. This wasn't supposed to happen. She hadn't meant to hurt anyone. She'd only wanted to feel safe. But now, looking at the guard doubled over in distress, she realized how reckless and misguided her actions had been. Tears welled up in her eyes as shame washed over her in waves. Security personnel quickly arrived on the scene, pushing through the crowd to reach Karen. Their expressions were stern, their movements purposeful. One of them gently but firmly guided the affected guard away from the area, leading him toward a nearby building where he could receive medical attention. Meanwhile, another officer approached Karen, his gaze locked onto her with an intensity that made her stomach churn. "Ma'am, step aside, please," he said firmly, gesturing for her to move away from the crowd. Karen obeyed without hesitation, her legs feeling like jelly beneath her. As she was led away, she noticed the sea of faces staring at her, some shocked, some angry, and some simply curious. A few people shook their heads in disbelief, muttering comments under their breath. Others pointed their cameras at her, capturing her mortified expression for social media. For the first time in her life, Karen wished she could disappear completely. Her mind replayed the incident over and over again, each loop amplifying her regret. Why hadn't she stopped herself? Why hadn't she taken a deep breath or walked away instead of letting panic take over? These questions swirled in her head, unanswered and relentless. All she could think about was the poor guard, who was now suffering because of her impulsive decision. As she was escorted to a quieter area near the palace gates, Karen's tears began to flow freely. She clutched her hands together, trying to steady her shaking body, but it was no use. Her emotions were raw and overwhelming, a mix of guilt, embarrassment, and sheer disbelief. She couldn't believe this was happening. Not here, not now, not to her. The security officers wasted no time questioning her, demanding an explanation for her actions. Karen stammered through her response, struggling to find the right words. "I thought he was going to hurt me," she managed to say between sobs. "I didn't mean to. I swear I didn't mean to." Her voice trailed off as fresh tears filled down her cheeks. She knew how ridiculous it sounded, even to her own ears. How could she possibly justify spraying a royal guard, a symbol of discipline and tradition, with pepper spray? There was no excuse, no justification that could undo what she had done. And as the weight of her mistake settled heavily on her shoulders, Karen realized one thing with painful clarity. This moment would haunt her forever. As Karen sat on a cold metal bench near the palace gates, surrounded by security personnel who were jotting down notes and exchanging serious glances, the full weight of her actions began to sink in. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she wiped away tears with the back of her sleeve. The pepper spray incident wasn't just some fleeting moment of panic. It was real. It had consequences, and there was no way to undo it. The security officers gave her little time to compose herself. They fired questions at her one after another, their voices firm but not unkind. "Why did you do it? Did you know he was a royal guard? Have you ever been in trouble before?" Each question felt like a punch to the gut, forcing Karen to confront the enormity of what she'd done. She answered as honestly as she could, her voice shaky and barely above a whisper. I thought he was going to hurt me," she repeated over and over again, as if saying it enough times would make it sound less absurd. But deep down, Karen knew how irrational her reasoning was. The guard hadn't said a word, hadn't raised a hand, hadn't done anything remotely threatening. He was simply doing his job, standing tall and silent, embodying centuries of tradition. And yet, in her moment of blind panic, she had turned him into something he wasn't. A danger, a threat, an enemy. The realization made her feel even smaller than she already did. Her mind kept drifting back to the image of the guard stumbling backward, coughing and clutching his eyes. She wondered if he was okay, if the pepper spray had caused any lasting damage. Was he angry, humiliated, or was he too well trained to let emotions show, even in a situation like this? These thoughts gnawed at her relentlessly, adding layers of guilt to an already suffocating sense of shame. Meanwhile, the crowd outside continued to buzz with activity. Some tourists lingered nearby, eager to catch a glimpse of the aftermath. Others whispered among themselves, speculating about what had happened. A few bold individuals approached the security team, asking if they could take photos or record videos. Karen buried her face in her hands, wishing more than anything that she could vanish into thin air. Every camera flash, every murmur of conversation, felt like a spotlight shining directly on her mistakes. At one point, a young family walked past her, their children pointing and giggling. "Look, Mommy, that's the lady who sprayed the guard," one of them said loudly. Karen flinched, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. Even though she knew they weren't malicious, they were just kids being curious. Their words stung deeply. It was a stark reminder that her actions had turned her into a spectacle, a cautionary tale for everyone else to gawk at. Despite her overwhelming regret, Karen couldn't help but notice the professionalism of the security team handling the situation. They didn't yell at her or berate her. Instead, they remained calm and focused, ensuring the guard received proper medical attention, while also gathering all the necessary details from her. One officer even handed her a tissue when he noticed her tears, his expression softening slightly. "Take a deep breath," he said quietly. "We'll figure this out." Those simple words brought a strange mix of relief and dread. On one hand, Karen appreciated the small gesture of kindness. It reminded her that she was still human, still capable of redemption. On the other hand, she knew that figuring this out meant facing the consequences of her actions, whatever they might be. Would she be arrested, fined, banned from returning to Buckingham Palace? The uncertainty loomed over her like a dark cloud. As the questioning dragged on, Karen found herself replaying the events leading up to the incident. If only she had taken a step back instead of pulling out the pepper spray. If only she had trusted that the guard wasn't a threat. If only she had listened to her own inner voice telling her to calm down. But regrets couldn't change the past. They could only shape how she moved forward. By the time the security team finished their initial investigation, Karen was emotionally drained. Her throat was sore from crying, her head throbbed from stress, and her heart ached with remorse. As they escorted her to a holding area to await further instructions, she couldn't stop thinking about the guard. Somewhere inside the palace grounds, he was recovering from the effects of the pepper spray, all because of her. Karen vowed silently to herself that she would find a way to make amends, no matter how long it took or how difficult it might be. She owed him that much, and so much more. The hours that followed felt like an eternity for Karen. After being detained temporarily in a small holding area near the palace gates, she was eventually taken to a nearby police station for further questioning. The sterile environment, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, metal chairs bolted to the floor, and the faint smell of disinfectant only heightened her anxiety. She sat slumped in her seat, staring at the table in front of her, replaying every detail of the incident over and over again in her mind. The officers handling her case were thorough but fair. They reviewed security footage from the palace grounds, spoke with witnesses, and even contacted the royal household to ensure they had all the facts straight. Karen answered their questions as honestly as she could, her voice trembling as she explained her thought process, or lack thereof, that led to the pepper spray incident. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she repeated, tears streaming down her face. "I just panicked." Once the investigation was complete, the authorities determined that Karen's actions, while reckless and inappropriate, weren't malicious or premeditated. However, that didn't mean there wouldn't be consequences. She was issued a hefty fine for assaulting a member of the Royal Guard, a penalty that left her reeling both emotionally and financially. Even worse, she was officially banned from returning to Buckingham Palace, a punishment that felt particularly cruel given how much she had dreamed of visiting it. News of the incident spread quickly. Within hours, headlines about the tourist who pepper-sprayed a royal guard began popping up online and in newspapers across the globe. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from outrage to mockery, with memes and jokes circulating widely. Some people criticized Karen harshly, calling her behavior disrespectful and embarrassing. Others found humor in the absurdity of the situation, turning it into a viral sensation. For Karen, Reading these comments was like reliving the nightmare over and over again. Each snarky remark or sarcastic caption cut deeper than the last. Back home in America, Karen struggled to adjust to life after the incident. Friends and family tried to comfort her, reminding her that everyone makes mistakes and urging her not to be too hard on herself. But the weight of public scrutiny was suffocating. Strangers recognized her at the grocery store or coffee shop, whispering behind her back or outright confronting her. Online trolls bombarded her social media accounts with hateful messages, forcing her to deactivate them altogether. It seemed impossible to escape the shadow of what had happened. Determined to make amends, Karen decided to take action. She spent days drafting a heartfelt letter of apology addressed to the royal household. In it, she expressed her profound regret for her actions, acknowledging the harm she had caused and taking full responsibility for her mistake. She also offered to donate a significant portion of her savings to a charity chosen by the royal family, hoping to demonstrate her sincerity. When she finally mailed the letter, she felt a glimmer of hope, a small step toward redemption. To her surprise, weeks later, she received a formal response from the royal household. The letter was brief but gracious, thanking her for her apology and noting that her gesture would be appreciated. While it stopped short of offering forgiveness, the acknowledgement gave Karen a sense of closure she desperately needed. For the first time since the incident, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could move forward. Still, the road ahead wasn't easy. Karen knew that earning back trust, both from others and herself, would take time. She vowed to use this experience as a lesson in patience, empathy, and self-awareness. Instead of letting shame consume her, she resolved to grow from it, to become someone who thought before acting, who approached unfamiliar situations with curiosity rather than fear. And though she might never set foot inside Buckingham Palace again, Karen hoped that someday people would remember her not for the mistakes she made, but for the effort she put into making things right. Months had passed since Karen's infamous pepper spray incident, but the memory of that day lingered like a stubborn shadow. Back in her small American town, life slowly returned to some semblance of normalcy, or at least as close to normal as it could get after becoming an international punchline. The initial wave of ridicule and judgment had subsided, though occasional reminders still popped up. A snarky comment from a coworker who'd seen the viral memes, or a random stranger recognizing her name during casual conversation. Each time, Karen felt the familiar sting of embarrassment, but she was learning to handle it better. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she could control how she responded to it. Karen spent countless nights reflecting on what had happened, dissecting every moment leading up to the incident. What struck her most was how quickly fear and panic had overridden logic. In hindsight, it seemed so obvious, so preventable. If only she had taken a deep breath, stepped away, or simply reminded herself that the guard wasn't a threat, none of this would have happened. But regret, she realized, wasn't productive unless it inspired change. So instead of dwelling on what-ifs, Karen focused on turning her mistake into a lesson, a story she could share with others to help them avoid similar pitfalls. One evening, while scrolling through social media, which she had cautiously reactivated, Karen stumbled upon a travel blog post titled "How Not to Be That Tourist." Her heart sank when she saw her own face featured prominently in one of the accompanying memes. At first, anger bubbled inside her. How dare someone make light of something that had caused her so much pain? But as she read further, she noticed the tone of the article wasn't entirely negative. The writer acknowledged that mistakes happen, especially when people are nervous or overwhelmed in unfamiliar settings. They even included tips for travelers on how to stay calm and respectful while visiting iconic landmarks like Buckingham Palace. For the first time, Karen saw her story from a different perspective. Yes, what she did was embarrassing and inappropriate, but it also highlighted universal truths about human behavior, how fear can cloud judgment, how cultural differences can lead to misunderstandings, and how important it is to approach new experiences with patience and humility. Inspired by the article, Karen decided to write her own version of the story, not to defend herself or seek sympathy, but to remind others of the importance of self-awareness and accountability. She poured her heart into the piece, describing everything from her excitement about visiting London to the overwhelming panic that led to the pepper spray incident. She didn't shy away from admitting her mistakes or expressing her deep regret. Instead, she framed the experience as a turning point, a wake-up call that forced her to confront her own flaws and grow as a person. When she hit publish on her blog post, her hands trembled with nerves. Would people judge her even more harshly? Or worse, would they dismiss her words altogether? To her surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Readers from all over the world reached out to share their thoughts, many thanking Karen for her honesty and vulnerability. Some confessed they had made similar blunders during their travels, while others admitted they might have reacted the same way in her shoes. A few even praised her for using humor and humility to address such a sensitive topic. For the first time in months, Karen felt a flicker of pride, not because of what she had done, but because of how she had chosen to handle it. Encouraged by the feedback, Karen began sharing her story more openly. She joined online forums for travelers, offering advice on navigating cultural differences and managing anxiety in unfamiliar situations. She volunteered at local schools, speaking to students about the value of learning from mistakes and treating others with kindness and respect. Slowly but surely, she transformed her shame into purpose, channeling her energy into helping others avoid the same missteps. Of course, there were still moments when doubt crept in. Late at night, when the house was quiet and her thoughts grew louder, Karen sometimes wondered if she would ever truly forgive herself. Could she ever look back on that day without cringing? Probably not. But maybe that was okay. After all, growth rarely came without discomfort. And if her story could inspire even one person to pause, breathe, and think twice before acting, then perhaps the embarrassment was worth it. As weeks turned into months, Karen found solace in knowing she hadn't let the incident define her. Instead, she had used it as a stepping stone, a chance to become wiser, kinder, and more self-aware. Though she might never see Buckingham Palace again, she carried its lessons with her wherever she went. Karen's journey from panic to redemption wasn't a straight line. It was messy, uncomfortable, and full of moments that tested her resolve. But as time went on, she began to see the pepper spray incident not just as a mistake, but as a catalyst for personal growth. It taught her lessons about fear, impulsivity, and cultural awareness that she might never have learned otherwise. And while she couldn't undo what had happened, she could use it to become someone better, not just for herself, but for those around her. One of the most profound realizations Karen came to was how much her actions were shaped by assumptions. Standing outside Buckingham Palace that day, she had let her imagination run wild, convincing herself that the guard posed a threat when he was simply doing his job. In hindsight, she understood that her reaction stemmed from ignorance of British customs, ignorance of the guard's roles, and ignorance of her own tendency to jump to conclusions under stress. This realization pushed her to educate herself more deeply about other cultures before traveling again. She started reading books, watching documentaries, and even taking language classes to prepare for future trips. Her goal was simple: to approach every new experience with respect and understanding, rather than fear or judgment. Karen also learned the importance of pausing before acting, a lesson she carried into all areas of her life. Back home, she noticed how often people reacted impulsively in stressful situations, whether at work, in relationships, or even during everyday interactions. Inspired by her own experience, she began advocating for mindfulness, encouraging friends and family to take a moment to breathe and think before responding to challenges. "You don't have to act immediately," she'd say. "Sometimes, waiting a few seconds can change everything." Her newfound perspective didn't stop there. Karen became passionate about sharing her story as a way to promote kindness and empathy. She realized that everyone makes mistakes, big ones, small ones, embarrassing ones. But what truly mattered was how they handled them afterward. By owning up to her error and working to make amends, Karen showed others that accountability wasn't something to fear, it was an opportunity to grow. Her talks at schools and community events resonated deeply with audiences who appreciated her honesty and humor. Even strangers online continued to reach out, thanking her for reminding them that no one is perfect, and that's okay. Despite the progress she made, Karen knew she would always carry a piece of that day with her. Occasionally, she'd catch sight of a picture of Buckingham Palace or hear someone mention the royal guards, and her stomach would tighten with a mix of guilt and nostalgia. But instead of letting those feelings overwhelm her, she chose to view them as reminders of how far she'd come. The incident wasn't just a low point, it was also the beginning of a transformation. Years later, when Karen looked back on her life, she saw the pepper spray fiasco as a turning point. It forced her to confront her flaws, embrace vulnerability, and commit to being a more thoughtful person. While she still dreamed of visiting London again someday, she accepted that some doors might remain closed to her. And that was part of the lesson too. Life wasn't always fair, but it gave you chances to learn and improve. In the end, Karen's story became less about the mistake itself and more about what she did afterward. She proved that even the most embarrassing moments could lead to meaningful change if you were willing to face them head-on. And though she might never stand beside a royal guard again, she walked through life with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to leave a positive mark wherever she went. After all, every misstep held the potential for growth. You just had to be brave enough to take the first step forward.